Hello, and welcome right here from Asia Society Switzerland in Zurich to a closer look at batteries. My name is Remko Tanis. In our series, A Closer Look, we take a quick but deep dives into places and topics that matter with people who possess first-hand knowledge on these issues. Today, we're looking at batteries in partnership with DKSH, a corporate member of Asia Society Switzerland, and we're very grateful for their support. Batteries increasingly power everything around us, all thanks to ever-accelerating innovation and a supply chain that spans the world, and that's where things get complicated. As battery costs sink, demand explodes, and technology advances, nations increasingly view batteries as vital for national security and economic competitiveness. This transition is shaping new geopolitical relationships, and with that, creating opportunity for new relations, dependencies, and conflicts. That's what we'll talk about in this edition of A Closer Look. Over the next hour, we'll talk with two excellent experts on the latest developments in batteries and the geopolitics surrounding them. You can submit questions already now through the Q&A function here on Zoom. If there's a question from someone else you see there and you think it's particularly worthwhile answering, you can upvote it, and that'll increase the chances we'll get around to it later on this hour. Now, before I introduce our two experts, I've got a quick overview for you that I think helps giving a bit of an indication on where we are in the world of batteries, which is described as now the fastest developing or evolving energy technology we've ever seen. I've got a few slides. Let me grab them. All right, where do batteries come from? Well, the critical raw materials in current day batteries are cobalt, graphite, lithium, manganese, nickel. And no country on Earth has all of these materials within its borders, but one country has the next best thing, and that is China. China absolutely dominates the mining and refining of all these raw materials, owing 80% of the global refining capacity, and getting the raw materials as well from mining operations it has in South America, Africa, Indonesia, and elsewhere. China also has a head start when it comes to battery production that seems by now impossible for other countries to catch up to, although we'll talk about that with our two experts soon. These are numbers from 2021, but the trend is still valid today. This is the production capacity of each country producing batteries for electric vehicles. You see China absolutely dominating there, and the number two, the US, at less than 13 times the capacity China had in 2021. Here as well, China absolutely dominates the supply chain. All the red bars is indicating China's share in the production and the globe-spanning supply chain of batteries. Then a quick look at where all this battery power ends up. This is just the demand, again, for electric vehicle batteries, which is clearly exploding since 2021. And if we just look at China again, the green share on this slide, in this graph, you see that demand there has doubled in less than 2 years. Here, another one, just the use of batteries in the global energy sector. It's just absolutely through the roof. Investments, same story. And with that, the price of a kilowatt hour of battery power is declining quickly. And just to give you an indication, so this is the price per kilowatt hour, which was close to $800 in 2013. Now sits at, well, what is it here? 170, 160, and it's still sliding down. But to put that in perspective, the average battery for an electric vehicle has a capacity of about 75 kilowatt hours. So in 2013 prices, that would cost close to $60,000 US. Now that's at 11,000 and rapidly declining. All right, batteries, everything that needs to happen before you can plug in and charge your car, your phone, and everything else. It's all very complicated. It's moving very quickly, and that's why I'm very happy to be joined by two experts in the field who will help us make a bit more sense of what's happening. First up, we have Marina Zhang. She's associate professor at the Australia-China Relations Institute of the University of Technology in Sydney. She writes and researches the intersection of technology and geopolitics, and delving into industries like semiconductors, critical materials, and electric vehicles. Marina is joining us from Beijing, China today. And second, we have Duo Fu. He's vice president of the Clean Tech division at Rystad Energy, which is a Norwegian research and energy intelligence company. Do is based in London, from where he heads Rystad's battery markets research. And I'll ask our two experts to turn on their cameras and their mics. And thank you very much for joining us, Marina and Do.
Thank you for having me.
Marina,
Thanks, Remko.
Marina, you're joining us from Beijing today. And I was wondering if there's anything you noticed in Beijing or elsewhere in China on your recent travels because the reason for my question is I was in Shanghai a few months ago, and it had been 5 years since I was there, and just the difference in the sounds on the streets was tremendous. It was just so much more quiet because of the enormous share of electric vehicles on the streets. Did you notice anything similar either in Beijing or elsewhere you've been to?
I do share your experience. I came back from Australia last April. That was after several years of disruption in global travel. So I was stunned by what I witnessed in China, because the impression was obviously more stark the first time after several years. And there are just so many different EVs on the road. And not just about the numbers, and also about diverse models of EVs. And I was very impressed. And it is quieter than before.
Though I was wondering, I referred earlier to the price drop of a kilowatt hour in battery power from $800 at the end of 2020, in 2013, to the official number is somewhere like $139 at the end of 2023. And in an earlier conversation you and I had, you mentioned that price could easily be cut by half again, even just in this year. I was wondering a simple question. How did that happen? Such an enormous price drop, and what can
It's a combination of reasons. The first two, which is the most important two, is the first one is the advance in technology, and the second one is really the economy of the scale. So basically, the more batteries we produce, the cheaper the price of the gas, same as any other commodities. And especially these days when we're talking about the China's keep ramping up, and with even outside of China, or the European manufacturers or the US startups, they are actively building their own facilities, incentivize different policies, helping by the incentives. So all this huge amount of production incentivized by the demand that we're seeing in the EVs, we're seeing in the energy storage sectors, and more other applications that when we're talking about today, there is a huge incentive for aviation sectors to decarbonize. There's mixed fuels. Also, the batteries is another type of alternative power source the industry is exploring at the moment.
Just to stay with you, as we saw briefly at the beginning of this hour, batteries are the end product of a highly complex globe-spanning supply chain. And I read somewhere the average mineral travels about 80,000 kilometers between being extracted from the ground and ending up in a battery cell. Facilitating that journey seems already complicated in a stable free trading world. We'll get into that later, but could you just briefly, even though that's maybe an impossible question, briefly describe what is the supply chain? What steps are basically needed to create a modern day battery, and why is it so complicated?
So go ahead, Marina.
No, you go ahead.
No, I was going to say, because there are different types of technologies being used these days. Traditionally, we would have the mining sector involved. Then with the new technology, the direct lithium extractions, we will have more of a drilling activity involved. Then again, we come into the processing of the materials. Then after the processing materials, come into the assembly of the battery cell, including electrode makings. Then, of course, coming into the packing, testing, then final product of the battery.
It is a globe-spanning supply chain. No one country has everything you need to produce batteries within its borders. And as I said, Marina, facilitating that journey is already complicated in a world that would be stable and open to free trade. So the current trends towards block forming and protectionism, tariffs, and other geopolitical tensions probably don't help making things easier. Could you point where are, according to you, the vulnerabilities in the supply chain from that perspective, and how could we deal with those?
The biggest vulnerabilities obviously is in the sourcing of critical minerals for battery making. As you said, China dominates the processing production of most of the those battery metals, but China doesn't own the deposits of all of them, especially a few elements such as cobalt that is largely deposited in Congo. And China has invested in mining in those countries, including, as you said, in Africa, in Latin America, in Australia, and in Asia. But geopolitical landscape is changing rapidly, and with so many unforeseeable factors that could disrupt this supply chain. But mind you, this kind of bottlenecks and vulnerabilities are partly caused by temporal mismatch between the demand and the supply in terms of total deposits and in terms of production capacity. Actually, they're not really very serious bottlenecks in terms of supply, even facing the burgeoning demand at the downstream application end. Let's talk about renewable energy transition, EV, and even new areas of, for example, healthcare and space industries. The reason is everybody is concerning that we will face these vulnerabilities and they send the demand upstream, as Dou just said, to the upstream, the battery cell manufacturing, and then upstream of mining, extraction, smelting, and so on. So this temporal mismatch is causing countries to increase their strategic stockpiling. And that is one of the reasons we seem to have this kind of a crisis. But in terms of real demand and supply, I don't think this is an issue. But geopolitical obviously can easily disrupt this equilibrium.
Do you see any vulnerabilities from your market research in the supply chain?
I just want to say I totally agree with what Marina just said. The supply side, there's no bottlenecks in terms of the raw material deposits, reserves on the ground. What we observe these days on the market is sometimes it take longer time for the permits to get granted for the mining activity, for the drilling activity. And what is the result of this is basically it takes around 8 to 10 years for the minings to from have feasibility study to actually be up and running to produce the materials. And for the time being, the industry shifts and develops really fast. So create a little bit of unsettled future for a lot of these business operators. So if we're thinking about mining activities, a couple of years ago, let's say 2 years ago, then what we're seeing is all the metal price was super high, it was rocketing up on a daily basis. Now what we're seeing today is completely different landscape, which is more of an adjustment back to the supply demand fundamentals.
Is it because just recently though China-based companies just keep taking controlling stakes in mines in Africa, in Congo, for example, but also a few other countries. And I read this piece last week that said, well, how much about these Chinese companies just keep buying these access to mines? How much of it is about meeting the demand of their own processing plants and battery production plants? And how much is about just buying it so other countries can't buy it?
I mean, if we look today at the final end user demand, China's EV sector is one of the single large market still provides a promising future development in next couple of years at least. Today, when we look at the EV adoption rate, we're saying China has been enormous in terms of EV adoption rates. Although there are Western countries like Norway, especially in Nordic areas, there are high EV adoption rate. But when you look at annual growth level, you see in China is still growing at 25-30% of year-on-year growth rate. And this is extraordinary. I don't think any other single countries has this momentum that keep growing. When we look a year back, in Europe, we see a lot of strong expectations. We have a lot of potentials. We have a lot of ideas where the EV adoption rate we want the United States to grow. We want Germany, we want France, we want the UK to grow. And when we look at today and looking back for last 6 months, we're seeing a huge disappointment in terms of the energy transition pace development.
Marina, I wanted to ask you, I mean, we've referred to it several times, over 80% of the current battery production capacity is in the hand of China-based companies. Now, ambitions in Europe and the US are quite high at the moment to build their own supply and production chains before the decade is over, to at least be able to supply themselves with the battery power they want. How realistic is it that they can fulfill that before the decade is over? And is it realistic that they maybe want to catch up with where China is at the moment?
Well, it's surprising that the Western society thinks China's success of the EV and battery manufacturing is a kind of overnight success. That is not true. And over the past decade and even longer, let's say starting actually in 2014, China actually started to use industrial policies and government subsidies to support the EV manufacturing and battery manufacturing at both ends. What I'm saying is for both suppliers and the demand side, the consumer, and I mean, obviously EV is the customer of batteries. So this kind of growth at both ends creates enormous scale of production for China's cost advantages in these areas. And it's not really realistic for any country to catch up quickly, as you just mentioned, especially given the long lead time, as Dou just said, from extraction of mining to the final products. And that is about 8 to 10 years. But also, even you have all the permission, and from the initiation of a project to the production of battery batteries, that will take about 18 months. So if we put all those together, and you realize to be realistically, and especially under the pressure we're all facing to manage a global clean energy transition, and for those countries to build a China Plus One supply chain to use as a backup, let's say just in case supply chain is possible, but consumers and users need to pay more. But to have a supply chain in comparison with China in terms of cost advantages is almost impossible in a short period of time. The reason is because the long, complex supply chain, well, China, most companies, they can manage in an integrated fashion. So relatively, their supply chain is much shorter than most supply chains can be facilitated by a country like the US or even EU. And if a battery can travel another 8,000 kilometers or miles, and you can imagine the cost will go off the roof. So we're facing a dilemma, whether we need to move to clean energy transition or we're fighting against these critical strategic resources.
Though in a conversation we had earlier, you mentioned about this as well, that building a local supply chain can create some anxiety for Western industries, given how processing plants for raw materials are polluting and use lots of energy themselves. Then there are, of course, the concerns of labor and human rights in the places where raw materials are being extracted. We talk about, of course, the enormous dominance of China-based companies in the field, but let's not forget here in Switzerland we have Glencore, one of the biggest mining operations in, well, the Congo is the first example that comes to mind. But what I wanted to ask you is how do you see Europe and also the US's capability of competing and producing high quality products at a low cost, the way China has managed that in the field of batteries, given all the concerns that it takes pollution and financial as well?
there are two elements: whether the Europe and the US can produce in terms of technical capability, and whether they can produce at the same price versus China's operating is two questions. I mean, most of the Western companies, especially mining companies, they definitely can. They have the technologies, but the difficult part is the cost, thus which being conveyed to the end product as well. Even for years, there are companies in the West that produce batteries, assembly batteries. But one of the reasons that why the EV adoption rate is still stagnates in the Western world is because of the pricing. So today, when end consumers buying EVs, the first thing coming to their mind is how much I'm paying for this. Am I paying less towards the internal combustion engine cars? How much the fuel operating going to be like for the EVs? Of course, the fuel operating, which is electricity, is significantly cheap, but it did add some burdens when it's coming to the energy security comes into the instance coming to 2 years ago, where of course the European energy price increased humongously, and that is to say, all the end user consumers are very sensitive to the pricing, to the costs. It's the same as well with the mining sectors. The OEMs are very conscious of the material costs as well. So the OEMs are, which is car makers, they are very tight in terms of budgeting. They have a very structured way when it's coming to material procurement. Thus, it picture a saying that all the metal miners, processors, they have to maintain competitive when it's coming to the pricing. Of course, there are downsides to provide relatively low cost materials. The quality is one thing. Of course, there are different things, for example, pollutions. There are concerns around pollutions, but we also have different technologies to combat these potential, hinders of the CO2 emissions. For example, a good example is the carbon capture, utilization, and storage as one of the amazing technologies being developed to combat the carbon emissions in heavy industries. So that to say, we should not always judging the lower costs countries, because there are different metrics when it's coming to the lower cost, and the countries are actively developing new technologies to combat the potential downsides of their bring out by the lower costs. For example, we're seeing majority of the nickels is produced in Indonesia, which is also a heavy polluting industries, which used in stainless steel primarily. Then we see intensive use in the batteries since the industry started flying roughly about decades ago. And so it's all mixed up together. And when we trying to conclude the potential of the European manufacturers, I'll just have to say, someday it will be quite of a reduction when it's coming to the cost comparing what we are today. And it will require a huge amount of effort between the governments, between the private sectors, to lowering the cost for the entire supply chain. But it is doable.
What doesn't help, of course, you mentioned the pricing and the sensitivity of consumers in purchasing an EV or a classic gasoline-fired car. What doesn't help there is tariffs, of course. I was just thinking over the past month here in Europe, or at least the majority part of Europe that watches the football championship currently in its final week in Germany. We've been inundated by ads for BYD, Build Your Dreams, the Chinese battery and EV company. At the same time, just last week, the European Union announced to impose a plan to impose tariffs on EVs imported from China, including BYD tariffs of up to 37.6%, I believe, although BYD will be subject to close to 20%. This follows, of course, the 100% tariffs the US imposed on Chinese EVs. I don't think it's a coincidence, but do correct me if I'm wrong, of course. BYD today signed, or yesterday signed an agreement to build $1 billion production plant in Turkey. The company is also building a car factory in Hungary within the EU, which is due to come online next year. A second one there is in the works. Maybe first Dol and then Marina. What's the impact of policies like these tariffs on the potential for batteries to power our cars, our homes? Does it eventually slow down the progress we thought we were making?
You mean me first or Dol first?
Marina, you go first.
There
You go first.
Dol,
Okay.
how about you, Dol?
Okay, those are two sides of things. One is to do the tariffs. A lot of the time is to do with protect the local markets, which it does make sense. Majority of the markets have some level of these tariff measures against other countries. But does it really doing good for the energy transition is another question, right? So of course, the reason they're trying to block Chinese EVs is the cost and the final selling price. But when you're comparing the EV sale in China and the EV sales in Europe, what they might forgot to compare is, although the price might still slightly lower than the other brands sold in EVs, which is the local manufacturers, but it is already significantly higher than what the specific brands like Great Wall, Geely, or let's say BYD, what they sold in China. So that is to say, it is not the primary goal to disturb the markets of these companies. And or I think at some point it is the traditional car makers need to have a bit of thought about why there is a huge difference in the productions, which part of the cost that's incurred can be mitigated, comparing to Chinese automakers. But again, it is something potentially important to think as well is the volumes. Once the Europe block out the majority of the Chinese EVs that goes into the Europe, will the local OEMs able to fill it off? And if the local OEMs can't do it, will that incur and incentivize the local consumers just to switch back to the ICE cars? Because that is not what we want. I don't think that is anyone wants that for people to
ICE
switch
cars,
back
you mean
to
just cars powered by gasoline, diesel, and things?
Yes, exactly.
Marina, I'm curious to hear your take on this as well, but I also want to put in front of you, if I may, a piece I read last week in the Financial Times from economic historian Adam Tooze. He wrote about the extraordinary pace of China's green energy investment in recent years. And he writes, that investment is our best hope of achieving climate stabilization in time to stave off, his words, planetary disaster. Now, China has responded just this week to the plan from Brussels to impose tariffs on Chinese imported EVs, saying it's hypocritical and it harms the joint effort to combat climate change. I was curious, what's your take on that?
Well, I think both sides got their solid arguments. And when we're talking about comparing, let's say, the tariffs in the US and in the EU, and we must differentiate the two markets, they're very different. And first of all, China's EV makers had hardly any presence in the US market, but is gaining market share in the EU countries. And second factor I want to point out is United States is a unified market for Chinese EV makers, but Europe is different. And as you mentioned, and the Chinese companies, not just BYD and CATL, the battery maker, the leading battery maker, has already invested in Europe in production. So this is their strategy to diverse their routes of exporting their EVs and the batteries to the global market. This this increasing protectionism globally, led by the US and the Inflation Reduction Act, and even a few European Raw Materials Act, whatever the name is called, they are increasing the costs, and they are delaying the process of clean energy transition. But on the other hand, when we're facing such a complex geopolitical landscape, and no country wants to rely on a concentrated supply chain by one country, that is China. So we must balance this thing. I totally agree with Dong mentioned earlier that it is from technological perspective, is totally doable for the Western country to develop a separate supply chain. But the question is costs. And when the EV adoption is at the verge of so-called tipping point, and consumers, the one very important determining factor for EV adopters is price. And this protectionism, increased tariffs, obviously will increase costs for the consumers, and ultimately that will add to the costs of climate change. And if we look at the global, and put aside all geopolitical values differences in these areas, and if we only think about the planet, well, we should move more in a more collective way.
I have one follow-up question for you, Marina. First of all, there's already some excellent questions coming in from our audience. Do keep them coming. We'll get to them in 10 minutes or so. But Marina, I was wondering, when we spoke earlier, you mentioned, well, and Dol referred to this as well earlier in this conversation, the enormous cost China has made investing in the technology. It's not just something that came about in the last year. And you mentioned, well, is it really smart for other countries to now go through that same process and try to reinvent the wheel more or less? Or maybe they should just accept that here China is leading and see how they can benefit from China's position and technology and knowledge?
Well, China's leading companies, BYD and CATL, for example, they're not standing still, just waiting for the Western countries to catch up. And the reason, I mean, over the past 10 years, China could achieve such a catch up or turnaround is I totally agree with what Dole just mentioned, is multiple factors. And policy is one of the areas, factors that China holds in very, very significant advantages. But that doesn't say all the countries, they're using industrial policies, and when they put the money into these sectors, they will quickly catch up. And if you look at the number of technological achievements by Chinese firms in these areas, CATL, 3 years ago, they had a workforce in the R&D, dedicated to R&D, is about 5,000 people, and over 150 having a degree, having a PhD. And this kind of manpower is very, very hard for any country to match in a short period. And we know the battery manufacturing is very much concentrated in 3 countries: China, South Korea, and Japan. And in fact, both South Korea and Japan, they held a lot more technological advantages against China 10 years ago. But the reason is innovation is not just about invention. It's not just about technological breakthroughs. It's about commercialization. China's commercialization explains the chart you showed to us at the very beginning, the very rapid decline in price. So that is one of the very, very significant reasons we often ignore. And China still accounts for 50% of the EV market globally. I think Dong mentioned this as well, right? So the point I want to say is, and also in terms of scientific publications, the patent applications, China is now leading against all major competitors. So I think is not the matter that the whole world should rely on China. I think China as well as the world should have an open-minded approach to talk about open standards, protocols, how this country can work together. And the fact that Chinese companies are investing their supply chains in Europe is a good sign. And they're showing willingness to work. And they might just move semi-finished components to Turkey, to Hungary, and to make the final products. But that itself is making a contribution to the local suppliers, upstream suppliers, and they're creating jobs for the local people. And those contributions shouldn't be discounted easily. And China is making this. The reason is China is facing very severe energy crisis. And energy, unfortunately, is one very important factor, one of the very important factors that determine the narratives of our geopolitics. So China is determined to lead on the next energy revolution. So I think in this new revolution, it requires global effort. It's not one country. It's not one man show. Not one China's show.
Thank you, Dole. I wanted to ask you about innovation and these aspects because just yesterday, the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong wrote about the claim from Chinese scientists that they are at the verge of a breakthrough, which could further annihilate the cost of batteries and develop a next generation, as it's called, solid state battery that can match performance of modern batteries at 10% of the cost.
Yeah.
And there was a quote from Chen Lichuan, who is called the father of the Chinese lithium battery. He calls it the future of rechargeable battery technology. But meanwhile, also yesterday in the US, it was reported that at least 7 major EV and battery producers are also about to deploy newly developed battery technology within the next 2 years. Where is this going? Should we place bets like which side is going to determine the future of the next generation technology, or is this going to be a mix? Are you going to choose like Apple or Microsoft, so to say, or?
So it's really, when it's coming to technologies, it's really a diverse picture. It doesn't know technology is going to be one fit for all. It's going to be, the technologies find its designated end user markets and its applications. Solid state is something that the entire industry has been expecting for at least a decade long. And even before China starts to have these battery booms, Japanese are the ones that primarily work on the technologies and keep announcing breakthroughs every once in a while for I don't know how long, so just a very long time. And everyone's still expecting that, and they're putting a lot of faith into that, not just because of the energy densities, safety reasons, but it is the people that genuinely believe batteries can help the world becoming more clean and solve a lot of the energy issues, especially when we talk about energy's storage potential to help with the grid.
And just may interrupt you real quickly. Can you just, for a complete amateur like myself, explain why solid-state lithium batteries are better for example, my EV or in my phone? I don't know where they'll end up, compared to the technology that we've been having access to so far?
There's primarily 2 reasons. One is the safety, because it doesn't have the liquid electrolytes, and it can definitely survive from the piercing tests. And the second is also because the energy densities that can hold is very large comparing to what the traditional NMC batteries or NCA batteries can hold. These are primary reasons, and which giving the batteries more potential to be used in high-end user cars, in aviations, and also even when we talk about solid state is not a new chemistry. It's to do with you can pair solid state with LFP cathode. You can pair with NMC cathode or even sodium cathode. So it's really something not completely different to the chemistry. It's more to do with development on the electrolytes side. Aside from this, there's also other technology that is being promoted by a variety of governments. For example, redox flow batteries that people redeem as the future of the long duration energy storage batteries. And we have sodium batteries that can potentially help relieve the anxiety of, people when think about mining pollutions or the ethical mining prospects.
Mm-hmm.
So all these technology developments are incentivized by all the governments because no one wants to put all the eggs in one basket. So, and it is required to have a variety of technology developed at the same time.
Does it mean that with these new technologies, say, like the Americans claim, it might be introduced in new EVs in a year or two or so? I could just drive from Rome to Hamburg with one 5-minute charge somewhere mid-Germany, or?
It's probably not in a year or two.
Oh, okay. That is the direction I should think in, like eventually, or?
But we are seeing the driving ranges in the batteries are getting longer, even in the existing technologies. We're talking about, ultra high nickel NMCs, nickel, cobalt, manganese batteries. We are also seeing this improved energy density in LMFPs. All these can lead to the better user experience. This is the ultimate people cares about, cost and user experience.
Right. Marina, I have one more question for you, but just a final reminder to the audience. There's still time to put in your questions. We'll get to them very, very soon. And maybe you have one that also came in from the audience, Marina, is it seems the lens through which we have to increasingly view each topic in the next 4 months or so. What will happen to U.S. efforts to build their own battery industry and the way the U.S. positions itself also in these tariffs under an eventual Trump administration?
This is a very hard question to answer. We cannot predict American U.S. Election results. I guess we can, expect chaos if Trump is elected. That is, in the short term, I'm not sure that is good for China or not. The reason is Trump is, given his track record, he's very likely to restore the U.S. the American first policy, and that can alienate the U.S. From its Western allies. And that is, for short term, is perhaps good for China because China doesn't want to face a unified Western society. So that will probably give China a bit of leeway, an opportunity to work clearly with European allies, European partners. But in the long run, and this will have more disruption for the clean energy transition. So that's obviously not something people can easily just give forecast. But just I want to add to what Do mentioned about a solid state battery. At the moment, Japan is still the country that holds the highest patent number in solid state batteries. China is catching up quickly. But as I said, innovation is not just about patents, it's also about commercialization. And China's government is very determined to develop the second stage of batteries.
Dol, I wanted to ask you before I move on to the questions from the audience. There are, of course, more fundamental uses of energy in whichever form it comes than driving from Rome to Hamburg with a short charge. I was wondering, what do all these developments that we've seen going so quickly, both in innovation and the steep drop in price of battery power, what does it all mean for people around the world who thus far maybe not have had access to a traditional power grid?
when you see traditional power grids, then that means it's somewhere quite remote. And if in this case, which means that the user experience, the charging user experience for them might be pretty poor. At what people preserve that most people like to charge at home. In this instance, that is something the government and private sector need urgently to improve across all the countries. China is doing well, and there are countries doing well as well in the Europe. But again, these development at the moment is still not enough. We will continue to see improvement in the charging infrastructures, and that is to say, we'll need better grid infrastructure to cope with the charging infrastructure development. For those that have, let's say, not access to the grid infrastructures, there are solutions. For example, renewable coupled charging stations are one of the potential solutions. For example, we can have a large wind or solar wind farms that connect to the charging station, if that's possible. Then we also need to think about in some of the well-developed countries in terms of the charging infrastructure deployment, there are also other bottlenecks. So everyone in the business is still facing different types of bottlenecks. Even if people already have plenty of charging points installed, utilization rate for them is a huge problem. Profitability for the operators is a huge challenge. And for those countries who are not having enough charging points deployed, where to deploy them, how to deploy them effectively, whether it's the responsibility that falls into the private sector or the public sector, are the ones that for them to consider. So it depends on which phase you are in this, charging infrastructure development maturity stage.
I want to ask you both about where we are, and this is a question from our audience as well. Where we are with recycling in all this. I mean, we've talked briefly about the enormous boom in electric vehicle usage in sales in China, compared especially to the rate in Europe and the US. Not too long ago, this photo also went viral from, I believe, a field somewhere near Hangzhou in eastern China, with just EVs in the field, overgrown, who were maybe 2-3 years old, but already traded in for new models, just like you would trade in your phone every 2 or 3 years, because the prices are so low. And why not? The newer cars have much newer technology. That kind of drove home the question for me, and then also in our audience now, I see where are we with recycling? Not just China maybe, but just in general, the industry. Not just out of an environmental viewpoint, perhaps, but also recycling as a potential secondary source of raw materials for next generation batteries. Marina, would you want to go first?
Sure. As far as I know, CATL is developing very advanced recycling technologies. And their CEO was recently interviewed, and he said the company now has the capacity of recycle critical minerals, for example, cobalt and lithium, up to 95%. So that is very high rate of recycled metals. The critical issue is to build localized and digital data-driven facilities to recycle batteries. Because potentially, if this kind of waste is not managed well, that can create a lot of pollution, and we don't want to see that. But this comes to another issue, that is to build these data-driven facilities that requires a global effort. Because if you want to trace a specific user's battery usage, and you need to collect data. And this is an area where we cannot reach consensus yet. So this, but in terms of battery cycling facilities in China, it has already reached a certain scale of production.
Do you have anything to add to that?
I think on the recycling, it's probably one of the things that all the Western and Eastern world has in common, that they recognize it is something needs to be done, and we're seeing a huge amount of capacity start to be built in the States, in Europe as well. And we've seen collaborations between battery makers, automakers, and traditional recyclers. And this is one of the good things. And in Europe, I really like the new battery regulations when it's coming to determine whoever produces the battery needs to thought about the recycling final end of the batteries. So this is something I do believe it will be the future, but at the moment there are still challenges. But I think it's a good way to for the entire industry supply chain to work on this together when it's in coming to in next couple of years, how to for these operators to survive when the feedstock is relatively low and primarily come from the battery manufacturing facilities rather than end of life, where we're seeing the batteries in the vehicles are recycled and where the batteries in energy storage are recycled. So, first thing to keep all these company alive is an important thing to incentivize people keep doing it, because otherwise, without them, there's no industry.
Right. It's another question from the audience is, I mean, we've discussed tariffs on the finished product, the EV imported from China. There's also a tendency for certain countries, especially the mineral-rich countries, to put tariffs on the export of unrefined materials, or like in the case with Indonesia, just say, no, you have to refine what you extract within our country, like Indonesia is doing with nickel, resulting in many Chinese nickel processing plants in Indonesia at the moment. Member of our audience says that apparently now Chile has also announced a plan to increase the tax on export of unrefined lithium. On that side of the production chain, so not the finished product, but the raw material tariffs, what is the trend there? I don't know which one of you would like to take this.
So you go first.
Okay, I think for the nickel on the from the Indonesia point is more about to provide the more value-added products. And this is the same thing I think Marina probably echoes more when coming from the Australian perspective, is because this is what Australians been trying to do for years and years, starting from iron ore and or other raw material in the heavy industry product making. So I think it's something that's worth to develop rather than for the country be a primary export of the raw material.
Yeah, Marina, last year you published an article, I believe the title was The Geopolitics of Lithium from an Australian perspective. It would be an entirely new webcast probably, but how is Australia in this? Of course, also a mineral, like a raw material rich country in that sense.
Well, Australia obviously is in a very awkward position in the geopolitical sense. The reason is most mineral-rich countries, they're either in the global south or in the Belt and Road Initiative countries, which are more, accepting China's investment, because China bringing to them not just investment but also technologies and helping develop local economy. But Australia is one of the countries that is on the demand side of the global Western allies. So, but Australia is relying on China for the processing capabilities, but politically, Australia is more closely linked, allied with the US and EU. So this put Australia in a very difficult position. But Australian government, as Adol said, is emphasizing building local value-added capabilities. It's hard.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's another country in the region to like really stretch the concept. I can hear an echo, but maybe that'll disappear again. We have a question on South Korea, which, and Marina, you already referred to Japan as well, and then South Korea as being very innovative in this space. The question is, some of the most innovative EVs are produced in South Korea by Hyundai and Kia. Where is South Korea in the global competition here?
I just finished research on the global EV, and my study on the EV market globally by the as of the end of 2022, both Kia and Hyundai actually among the top 20 EV makers. So among the top 20 EV makers, 9 are Chinese. So Kia, I think, was ranked around number 11. And Hyundai is about number 13. They might have most of innovative EV models. I don't know. I mean, I saw them in Australia. But to diffuse their products globally is a different matter. But they do have very good infrastructure in car dealership globally. This is also linked to the battery production. So as we all know, before too long, Panasonic and LG Chem, they are actually among the top 3 battery makers. But again, by the end of around 2023, and China's CATL and BYD became the top one. And I think the third one is either LG or Panasonic. I think it's LG. So they're losing their market share. The reason is because of cost. As we discussed so far today for a lot, that China possesses these consolidated, shorter and more efficient supply chains of battery making.
It's almost time to wrap up. I have one more question for both of you. And I was wondering, could you both please kind of tell me what is the biggest hurdle you see at the moment for the batteries evolving further and also like reaching a full potential or beyond that in not just EVs, but also in energy storage, also just in regular homes, for example. So what is the biggest hurdle at the moment you see? And also what gets you most excited for prospects of maybe the near future, even when it comes to how we as consumers, but maybe also as countries use batteries and the technology behind it. Doel, you want to go first?
I guess I'll tackle the points when it's coming to the deployment of residential energy storage. I mean, the key, there's a different phase of challenges to deploy these technologies. So historically, the cost of the batteries are the primary reasons it scares people off. Then when it's coming to last 2 years, where combined with COVID and energy price hikes in Europe, and what we're seeing is people are becoming more willingly to accept the energy storage, especially coupled with PV panels, residential PV panels. Then what we're seeing here today is the decline in the energy price, especially the gaps during the intraday, are not really incentivizing them to do anymore, because especially also together with a lot of countries started canceling the feed-in tariff. So suggesting that they are not be able to create revenue like in the past. And these are the potential hurdles. But gradually we are seeing more and more people on the market are selling home residential energy storage, small size. For example, 5 kilowatt is the standardized system that being sold mostly in Europe, and some smaller size like 3 kilowatt are also quite welcomed in the region. So people are becoming more and more willing to accept energy storage.
All right, Marina, do you have any points to add? Oh, I think you're on mute.
I think the most critical factor is geopolitical factor in energy. Energy, as we all know, is a factor that defines our era. just like what coal has defined the coal era and oil defined the coal era. So because energy crisis can extend to economic crisis, we have witnessed in the 70s several times, and each country tries to capitalize on this energy transition. We know crisis, climate change is urgent. But also I think with technological advancement, the cost will go down substantially. And when it reaches a tipping point, more people will adopt EVs, will adopt energy storage. And then by then, the policy probably will play a less important role. And we can see European is more committed to clean energy transition than what US is. So this will obviously put Europe as a leading position to adopt more EVs and to adopt more renewable energies, because batteries are not just for EVs, they're also for storing renewable energies generated by wind or by solar. So I do hope that we will work together collectively, and every country will have accessible and cost-effective batteries and EVs to save our planet. That's my hope. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And well, not surprising, it all comes down to money in the end. But given the sinking kilowatt-hour price of battery power, I think we're looking at some great potential. But that's not something I needed to tell you, but at least that's what I got away from this. Marina Zhang and Dolfu, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your insights on this webcast. And thank you all for watching. And we'll leave it at this. And we hope to see you again soon at one of our future events. Thank you once again.